The suicide rate for American men peaks between ages 45 and 64, not in adolescence, not in old age. In 2022, the Centers for Disease Control reported that men in that bracket died by suicide at a rate of 29.4 per 100,000, roughly 3 times the national average across all ages. The American Psychological Association, in its 2023 Stress in America survey, found that adults aged 45 to 54 reported the highest levels of chronic stress of any age cohort. The divorce rate for Americans over 50 has doubled since 1990, a demographic phenomenon researchers at Bowling Green State University named the Gray Divorce Revolution. Meanwhile, the General Social Survey, tracking American happiness since 1972, shows a consistent U-shaped curve across the lifespan, satisfaction bottoming out. In the United States, at an average age of 47.2. The World Happiness Report 2023, drawing on Gallup data from 137 countries, found that same trough reproduced in 57 of them. The pattern is not cultural, it is structural, and it has been happening longer than most people realize. The midlife crisis, that phrase that has been diluted into a punchline about sports cars and affairs, was first formally described by psychoanalyst Elliott Jaques in a 1965 paper published in the International Journal of Psychoanalysis. Jaques was studying the lives of 310 artists and composers and noticed something precise. Creative output underwent a measurable shift around age 35 to 40. The urgent, hot productivity of early careers gave way either to something more contemplative and profound, or to nothing at all. Artists either deepened or stopped. He named what happened in between a crisis of mortality confrontation. The phrase that survived his work, midlife crisis, stripped out the mortality part. That stripping is the entire problem. What Jaques identified was not a crisis of vanity. It was a crisis of reckoning. At some point in the middle decades, the human brain stops processing the future as an abstraction and begins processing death as a fact. This is not a metaphor. Neuroscientist David Eagleman at Stanford has documented that the subjective experience of time accelerates with age in part because the brain stops generating novel memories at the rate it once did. Each new year contains fewer genuinely new experiences, which makes the year feel shorter in retrospect. By 50, the accumulation of repeated patterns means the last decade can feel, in memory, like 3 or 4 years. The horizon closes, not because life is ending imminently, but because the brain is finally doing arithmetic. If you've been finding this kind of analysis useful, subscribe. There's more where this came from. Laura Carstensen, director of the Stanford Center on Longevity, has spent 3 decades studying what she calls socio-emotional selectivity theory. The core finding: as people perceive their time horizon as shrinking, whether due to age, illness, or any other perceived limitation, they systematically shift their priorities away from information gathering and toward emotional meaning. Younger people collect experiences, relationships, and credentials at scale. Older people cut. The shift is not passive resignation. It is an active, neurologically driven reorganization of what the brain decides to care about. Carstensen's 2006 paper in Psychological Science showed that adults over 60 recalled emotionally positive images at significantly higher rates than younger adults, who showed no such preference. The brain begins editing. By 50, the editing has usually started. The problem is that the editing begins before the infrastructure for a different life has been built. That gap between what the brain is beginning to want and what the life currently provides is where the data shows the damage accumulates. Roughly 43 million Americans are estimated to be in what researchers at the MacArthur Foundation's research network on midlife development called the squeeze generation. Adults between 40 and 60 simultaneously supporting children and aging parents. The network's landmark MIDAS study, Midlife in the United States, surveyed more than 7,000 adults and found that this cohort reported higher rates of role conflict, sleep disruption, and what the researchers called overload than any other age group. The financial data confirms it. The Federal Reserve's 2023 survey of consumer finances found that adults aged 45 to 54 carry the highest median debt load of any age cohort, $168,000, while simultaneously approaching the period when retirement savings decisions become irreversible. The pressure is not imaginary. It is compound. And then there is the workplace. The Bureau of Labor Statistics has tracked what economists call job displacement, involuntary job loss due to position elimination, and found that workers over 50 who lose jobs remain unemployed, on average 35% longer than workers under 35 in comparable fields. A 2019 study by economists at the Federal Reserve Bank of San Francisco sent 40,000 fictitious resumes to job listings and found that applicants with names suggesting ages over 50 received significantly fewer callbacks, with the gap widest for women. The experience of sudden professional irrelevance at exactly the moment when financial obligations are highest, and when the brain is beginning to demand more meaning from work, is not a coincidence of timing. It is a pressure system. It bears stating plainly, the society that tells people their 50s are the prime of life has arranged things so that the 50s are, statistically, the most financially leveraged, professionally precarious, and biologically transitional decade most people will experience. That is worth sitting with for a moment. But the same data that documents the collapse contains, in its own numbers, the mechanism of the recovery. The U-shaped happiness curve does not stay at the bottom. It rises. In Gallup's global data, happiness scores climbed steadily from the trough through the 60s and into the 70s, reaching levels that often surpass the peaks of early adulthood. The question researchers have spent 2 decades trying to answer is why, and the answer turns out to have almost nothing to do with external circumstances improving. Subscribe if you want to keep going deeper on this. Psychologist Susan Turk-Charles at the University of California, Irvine, in a 2010 paper in Psychological Bulletin, synthesized decades of research under what she called the strength and vulnerability integration model. The central finding: older adults are, on average, better at regulating negative emotion than younger adults. Not because life gets easier, but because the brain gets more efficient at what it has practiced. The neural architecture for emotional regulation, primarily the prefrontal cortex and its connection to the amygdala, literally becomes more practiced at suppression, reappraisal, and selective attention over time. People who survive difficult decades are not just psychologically scarred by them, they are also trained by them. The divergence, why some people break at 50 and others accelerate, is, in the data, largely a function of what researchers at the University of Rochester call psychological flexibility. A 2020 meta-analysis published in the Journal of Contextual Behavioral Science, reviewing 174 studies, found that individuals with higher psychological flexibility, broadly defined as the capacity to hold difficult thoughts and emotions without being controlled by them, showed significantly better outcomes across depression, anxiety, chronic pain, and general life satisfaction, with effect sizes that grew larger in midlife cohorts. Psychological flexibility is not a personality trait in the conventional sense. It is a practice capacity, and it is unevenly distributed by class, education, and access to mental health resources. The data on who breaks, when examined carefully, is a class story as much as a psychological one. The 2022 General Social Survey found that adults without college degrees reported bottoming out in life satisfaction roughly 5 years earlier than college graduates, and recovering more slowly. A 2021 study in the Journal of Health and Social Behavior, using MIDAS data, found that the health deterioration associated with midlife stress, elevated cortisol, accelerated cellular aging measured by telomere length, increased inflammatory markers, was significantly more pronounced in adults with incomes below the median. The biology of midlife crisis is not uniform. Its severity is socioeconomically stratified. Among those who report transformation rather than collapse, the research identifies a pattern with almost uncomfortable consistency. A 2018 study by Dan McAdams, professor of psychology at Northwestern University, examined the life narratives of adults who described midlife as a turning point toward greater personal meaning. McAdams found that the single most consistent feature of their accounts was what he called a contamination to redemption narrative structure. Not the denial of loss, not toxic positivity, but the specific cognitive move of acknowledging that something genuinely ended while insisting that the ending made something else possible. The story people told themselves about their own lives was doing measurable work on their outcomes. This is not a finding about the power of positive thinking. McAdams is careful about that distinction. The narratives that correlated with positive outcomes were not falsely optimistic. They contained real grief, real acknowledgement of what had been lost. What distinguished them was their refusal to let loss be the last word in the sequence. The people who broke at 50 and stayed broken were, disproportionately, people whose internal narrative had no second act. The gender data at 50 is, by any honest reading, A story of two almost entirely different experiences happening simultaneously. The Gallup Healthways Wellbeing Index, tracking more than 176,000 Americans between 2008 and 2012, found that women's emotional well-being dropped more steeply in their early 40s but recovered more fully by their late 50s, while men's well-being declined more gradually but, in a significant subset, did not recover at the same rate. The sociological explanation is not mysterious. Women in midlife are, in aggregate, better resourced in social connection. They maintain more close friendships, seek therapy at higher rates, and are more likely to redefine identity around non-career roles. Men in midlife are more likely to have defined themselves primarily through professional identity, and when that identity is disrupted, to have fewer alternative structures to fall back on. The clinical picture is consistent with this. The American Foundation for Suicide Prevention reports that men over 45 are the demographic least likely to seek mental health treatment and most likely to die by suicide. The gap between need and help-seeking in that cohort is not a personal failing. It is the predictable output of a culture that has spent decades telling men that asking for help is a form of weakness. A cultural instruction that becomes biologically dangerous at exactly the moment it is most likely to be needed. Subscribe. These numbers deserve to be in wider circulation. The emerging research on what actually produces transformation at midlife, rather than crisis, points consistently toward a small cluster of conditions that have little to do with income, status, or the external markers of a successful life. A 2023 paper by Becca Levy at the Yale School of Public Health, building on her decades of work on aging stereotypes, found that individuals who held more positive views of aging at 50 were, on average, 44% more likely to fully recover from a disabling health event and 7.5 years younger in biological age markers at 80. The expectation of what aging would feel like was reshaping the biology of how it unfolded. This is not a metaphysical claim. It is a measurement. A 2021 longitudinal study from the Harvard Study of Adult Development, one of the longest-running studies of adult life in history, now tracking its subjects' children as a second generation, found that the quality of close relationships at age 50 was a stronger predictor of health and life satisfaction at 80 than cholesterol levels, income, or professional achievement. Not the number of relationships, the quality. Adults who reported feeling securely known by at least one person at 50 showed slower cognitive decline, lower rates of chronic disease, and measurably higher self-reported meaning in late life. The data is not subtle. The relationship between feeling genuinely known and surviving midlife intact is as strong in the numbers as almost any clinical intervention. What this means in structural terms is that the people most likely to be broken by 50 are not the people whose lives look worse from the outside. They are the people who have successfully built lives optimized for external performance, high income, high status, sustained productivity, while systematically neglecting the relationships and self-knowledge that the data shows are the only durable infrastructure for the second half. Success in the conventional sense is a risk factor. The very qualities, productivity orientation, deferred gratification, identity investment in external achievement, that generate measurable success before 50 are, in the research, negatively correlated with well-being after it. That is the trap. And it is not accidental. The research on what distinguishes those who are freed by 50 rather than broken by it converges on a concept that developmental psychologist Erik Erikson called generativity. The shift in focus from personal accumulation to contribution to something larger than the self. Erikson named it in 1950 in his framework of psychosocial development, but the empirical work confirming its importance has arrived more recently. A 2017 study in Psychology and Aging, using MIDAS data, found that adults who scored high on generativity measures, concern for the next generation, sense of legacy, mentorship behavior, showed significantly lower rates of depressive symptoms in midlife and better cognitive function in later life. Generativity is not altruism as a lifestyle accessory. It is, in the data, a biological regulator. The people who get freed at 50, when the data is examined carefully, are mostly people who stumble into this shift, sometimes through loss, sometimes through illness, sometimes through a divorce or a job displacement that forced a reckoning they had been successfully avoiding. The external event is not what frees them. The reckoning is. The event just makes the reckoning unavoidable. Viktor Frankl, the Austrian psychiatrist who survived the Nazi concentration camps and founded logotherapy, wrote in Man's Search for Meaning, 1946, that human beings can endure almost any circumstance if they can find meaning within it. The research has spent 7 decades confirming that observation in ways Frankl could not have anticipated. A 2019 study published in JAMA Psychiatry found that adults with a high sense of purpose in life showed 2.4 times the survival rate from cardiovascular events as those with low purpose, with the effect size largest in the 45 to 65 cohort. Purpose is not a philosophical luxury. At midlife, it is measurably protective. The question the data keeps arriving at without answering is whether the transformation available at 50 requires the prior crisis to unlock it, or whether the crisis is itself a product of avoidable conditions, a society that front-loads identity formation, delays genuine self-knowledge, and then sends people into their most biologically transitional decade without any framework for what is happening. The evidence does not resolve this. Both things appear to be true simultaneously, and neither cancels the other. What the numbers do show is this: the people who come through 50 changed and intact are not the people who successfully avoided difficulty. They are the people who, for whatever combination of resources, relationships, and willingness to look clearly at themselves, managed to stop living for a life they had outgrown and start building one that fit the person they had actually become. The data does not call this resilience. Calls it development. The distinction matters because development implies that the transformation was always available. It was not waiting on better circumstances. It was waiting on permission. The final number worth sitting with. The Midas study found that a majority of American adults, when surveyed in their 60s, described their 50s as the decade during which they felt they finally understood themselves. Not their 20s, not their 30s, their 50s. The decade the data shows as the most stressful, the most biologically turbulent, and the most likely to produce crisis is also, in retrospect, the decade most commonly described as the one that made everything else legible. What remains unresolved is not whether the transformation is possible. The data is clear that it is. What remains unresolved is why access to it is distributed so unequally. Why the same decade that frees some people destroys others, and why the difference tracks so precisely along the lines of class, gender, and connection. The transformation is real. So is the inequality of its availability. Those two facts have not yet been made to face each other in any systematic way. The most consequential question the evidence leaves open: if the conditions that enable transformation at midlife can be identified this precisely, what would it mean to build them deliberately, and why hasn't that happened? If you want more videos like this, subscribe.